And when I was invited by Max to come and talk to the Soundings group in Leeds, he said, come and do a presentation, and I thought that what I would most usefully be able to talk about is the rise of religious fundamentalism and multi-faithism and its impact on women's rights, particularly black and minority women's rights. And I do believe that it is probably the most urgent and difficult issue that we are confronting today. So in the UK, historically, since the 70s, the struggle for women's human rights, especially in minority communities, and especially South Asian communities, has also involved a robust challenge to the politics of multiculturalism. And I will talk about that in a minute. So although multiculturalism was a useful concept in confronting racism, it was problematic in respect of struggles for gender equality within minority communities. And I say was because I find myself ironically now defending multiculturalism, given the backlash that there has been, not just in the UK, but across Europe. And what never ceases to amaze me is a lot of European countries that denounce multiculturalism having never even gone through that phase. Although, I would defend the concept, nevertheless, it was problematic for us in terms of women's rights. I think in more recent times, the struggle for women's human rights in minority communities has developed under the shadow of the politics of multi-faithism. And I think multi-faithism has replaced multiculturalism, and it's a regressive development at the heart of which lies the use of religion as the main means for social identity and mobilization. So what I'm going to do is draw on the experiences of Southall Black Sisters to try and show how the shift from multiculturalism to multi-faithism, which is now the dominant approach to minorities in the UK, has led to the shrinking of secular spaces at all levels of public life. And this has important implications not just for feminists, but also anti-racist and other progressive struggles for social justice. I think perhaps before I go any further, I should say a little bit about what I mean by secularism and why I think the concept is important. By secularism, I don't mean anti-religion, but I do call for a separation of state and church. And my call for a secular state, which Britain is not, does not presuppose the need, it does presuppose the need to ensure that there is separation of religion from political power. That's what I mean by secularism, which means that the rule of law and other essential political, civil, legal, society institutions and their functions should not be informed by patriarchal, anti-democratic religious values that are highly discriminatory and divisive in practice. So secularism on its own is not a guarantee for equality or democracy even, but it is an important precondition. And that is why the demand for a secular state must also be tied to the demand for democracy. And a democracy that is meaningful in that it enhances rather than hinders access to fundamental rights and freedoms in both the public and the private sphere. So before I say a little bit more about the shift to multi-faithism and its impact on women's daily lives, I should start first with a little history of Southall Black Sisters and work of Southall Black Sisters. The reason I do that is I think it will make clear how that progression from multiculturalism to multi-faithism has come about. We see it most clearly in the kind of struggles that we've waged at Southall Black Sisters. So SBS is now 30 years old. It was founded in 1979 in the heat of anti-racist activity in Southall, which was alluded to just now. So the late 1970s was a period of mass community secular mobilizations against racism. And this involved all sections of black and minority communities. So many in the anti-racist movement mobilized under a black political identity, which signified unity against common experiences of colonialism and racism, or histories of colonialism and experiences of racism. So that was a kind of context in which SBS was born. We came out of the uprisings of 1979, when those of you who remember will know anti-racists organized a mass demonstration to prevent the fascist National Front organization from marching through Southall, an area with a high South Asian population. And those protests between anti-racists, those protests by the anti-racists against the National Front led to mass arrests and assaults by the police, but significantly only on Asian and Afro-Caribbean male youth. And it also led to the murder of a white anti-racist activist, Blair Peach, who was killed by police officers from specialized militarized police units. But it was in the course of that kind of heated anti-racist struggle that Southall Black Sisters arose. So, although anti-racist struggles throughout the UK involved black, Asian, and Afro-Caribbean and other women as well, by the late 1970s, many black women felt the need to establish autonomous black feminist groups to counter the effects of both racism in the wider society and gender inequality within our communities. So the earlier struggles by black women, however, focused largely on the need to create unity amongst different groups of women, of minority women. And I don't want to over-romanticize that sort of notion of unity and argue that it was much better. It was a fragile unity. However, it was a unity, and it was vital in enabling black women to forge an inclusive, anti-racist and feminist identity. But in reality, much of the early activism by black minority women was also dominated by struggles against racism more than against patriarchy, for example. And this manifested in protests against immigration policies, sort of the anti-deportation protests, preventing family reunification, and of course, racial violence and police harassment. But when we set up Southall Black Sisters, we actually broke that mold. Having set up the first Black Women's Centre in West London in '82, our struggles and campaigns have drawn not only from experiences of racism, but also drawn on the routine experiences of the many women who came to us with stories of gender-based violence, persecution and imprisonment in their homes, and with it related issues of poverty, immigration difficulties, mental health, homelessness, matrimonial problems, etc. So right from the outset, our stance had to take account of women's experiences of violence and abuse in the family. And this was the main reason that we broke with the myth of community unity, because what we were trying to do was wage simultaneous struggles against both violence against women and racism, as well as other forms of injustice. So, for example, in the late 70s, we challenged the notorious practice of virginity testing on South Asian brides entering the UK on the basis of marriage. We challenged the practices for being both racist and sexist. But the wider protests against this practice focused primarily on the racial stereotyping of Asian women. But what they failed to emphasize was the fact that it was also a sexist practice, in that it denied Asian women their right to bodily integrity. It wasn't just a racist manifestation of state intrusion that we were challenging. And if you like, it was an early example of what is now fashionably referred to as intersectional discrimination, why some women are singled out for forms of discrimination and what increases their vulnerability was, in this case, the intersection of racial and gender inequalities. So the routine experiences of sexual and domestic violence led us to break the silence on domestic violence in our own communities in the 80s, early 80s. So we protested and campaigned and carried out street demonstrations around cases and issues affecting women and violence in minority communities. And the reason we were so visible about it was because, unlike the mobilizations in Southall against racism and racial violence, which were born out of anger and indignation, what happened was that the same community would respond to atrocities that women faced with absolute silence. So the same community can be quite angry and vocal in relation to racial violence and absolutely silent in relation to violence against women. And when we raised these concerns about domestic violence and the oppression of women, we were, of course, accused of washing our dirty linen in public. But interestingly, that accusation not only came from conservative elements in our communities who felt threatened by our challenge to patriarchal family values, but more disturbingly by the anti-racist left, who argued that by campaigning so publicly and raising issues of gender-based violence, we're fueling racism against the community, insofar as we're creating further negative stereotypes of culture, of minority cultures as backward, barbaric, and so on. Our response to these accusations was to argue that we couldn't prioritize the anti-racist struggle at the expense of the feminist struggle, or for political expediency. And we argued that by subscribing to the view that there is a hierarchy of oppression, we absolutely collude in our own oppression. We argued that there was a need to address the family, which was particularly important in anti-racist discourse as a site of a support against racism. So we argued that the family was also a site of female inequality, while also acknowledging that it could be a bulwark against oppressive state intrusion and racism, manifested, for example, in the kind of draconian, harsh, anti-family immigration measures and policies. Our early campaigning around issues of gender-based violence did create backlash in our communities, and it led to threatening the very existence of autonomous black women's groups, and ours was no exception. So in the mid-1980s, for example, we faced closure when local community leaders, who also held positions of power as local councillors, organized a petition calling for the withdrawal of our funding. At that time, the majority of our funding was from Ealing Council. We were accused by the community leaders of being outsiders, home wreckers, and of conspiring to destroy the very fabric of Asian culture. And they portrayed us as westernized and attempted to use their power effectively to delegitimize us and our concerns, and to place us outside constructions of community. We weren't part of the community, and so on. That's what their argument was. And the threat of closure led us to struggle, of course, to struggle for self-determination, self-organization. And it was many of our users who actually mobilized and protested, and arguing, the women who come to us on a daily basis argued that without SBS they had no safety net when escaping violence and abuse. So by mid-1980s, our casework was turning to the role of the state in responding to gender-based violence, and actually to the role of state in its complicity in the way in which women experience violence. And our challenge was to make the state more accountable to women's needs for protection in a context where domestic violence was largely regarded as a private matter. I mean, that was true for all women. And you know, they argue, and the context was that the state took no responsibility for the violent actions of non-state actors. And the situation was compounded in the case of black minority women by the existence of racism and by the politics of multiculturalism, which encouraged cultural sensitivity which in practice translated into non-interference in the family affairs of minority communities. So from about 1970 to 2000, multiculturalism was the dominant social policy approach to race relations between state and minority communities in the UK. It was first introduced in education, but was quickly accepted as a tool of national policy across a range of issues at local and national levels. Prior to the 70s, the initial focus of British race relation policies was on assimilation into the British way of life. I think it's all come back full circle in terms of the policies around integration at the moment. But this kind of, this move away from assimilation to multiculturalism gave rise to a form of multiculturalism which valued the need to recognize difference. And I think that was useful in confronting racism, which didn't want to recognize or value difference in our society. But the problem with that kind of state multiculturalism was that what began as the need to recognize difference became an end in itself. So a framework for simply recognizing and tolerating difference is what happened. So perhaps the most significant critique of the early multicultural model is that ethnic difference was constructed in stereotypical and essentialist manners, fixing and reifying boundaries of community affiliation. And in effect, in policy, the way that it manifested was the more different an identity, the more authentic it was seen. So we were critical of the multicultural model for constructing minority communities as homogenous wholes. And that meant that it provided the space for unelected community representatives, usually men, usually from religious and business classes, to determine the needs of the community. So it was they who acted as mediators between the community and the state. But in reality, they rarely recognized, let alone represented, the rights of women or other powerless subgroups within the community. So our starting point was that the daily experiences of South Asian women who were denied protection in the face of domestic violence and forced marriage. And often the response from the police and social services was one of indifference and non-intervention. And they justified this stance in the name of multiculturalism and even anti-racism. And the approach was deemed to be progressive, but in reality was simply reduced to the need to respect cultural and religious differences. So in a sense, my argument is that the struggle for female autonomy within minority communities is inextricably linked to the development of multiculturalism, since the approach itself lent to collusion with patriarchal systems of control for the control of female sexuality, and laid the foundation for a culturally relativist approach to women's rights. This approach left us with no option but to resort to the law often to challenge multicultural policies for their unintentional but often intentional effect in reinforcing rather than challenging abusive practices. At this point, I think it'll make more sense if I tell you about one of my most important cases that I dealt with to show you how multicultural policies actually played out in practice. And it's a case that will always remain with me because I think it sort of illustrated the problems that we were facing so beautifully. So this was 1989. We're dealing with a young girl called Afra. She was a 13-year-old Bangladeshi girl from Tower Hamlets in East London. So we had a head teacher ring us up and said that the young girl was really worried that her father was about to take her to Bangladesh and force her into a marriage, and that she didn't want the marriage. And the head teacher asked if we would go and talk to her. Actually, I should say that the head teacher was incredibly brave because she didn't seek parental consent. She actually just asked us, and the way we dealt with the matter was that I would go in at lunchtimes over a period of a few weeks to talk to her about her fears of being taken to Bangladesh and to see if these were just fears, or actually they were really going to, you know, sort of become a reality. She was a really bright girl who aspired to be a lawyer, but she was fearful. So she was one of 5 girls. Her oldest sister had also run away from home because of parental attempts to force her into a marriage. And the father was basically taking all the girls, the rest of the girls, home to prevent them from running away and following suit, following the steps of the older girl. So when I talked to her, of course, you know, she's only 13 years old. I'm trying to explain to her that actually she doesn't have many options as a young girl, as a minor. And the option for her was either to be taken into care or to remain with her parents. There wasn't another option. And I did talk to her at great length over a period of weeks, first of all to say, let's monitor the situation, because we didn't know for sure whether the parents would be taking her to Bangladesh, and secondly to see how she felt, given that these were the choices that she was presented with. And over a period of time, she kept in touch, and finally one day she rang up saying, look, I know that my only choice option is to go into care, but I still prefer that rather than be taken to Bangladesh, where I might be married and abandoned. And my father's just sorted out our passports and vaccinated us, so it's definitely on the cards. So at that point, I thought, right, okay, so we're going to have to go to court, and I'll have to get her a lawyer to represent her. I was actually going to bypass social services completely because I knew what their response was going to be. However, when we sought legal advice, we were told that at least we should approach social services so that at least we can show the court that we had attempted to try and enlist the help of social services, so we did. And what remains in my mind is the meeting I had with the social worker, with Afia present, with a letter of support from her older sister, who had maintained contact with Afia, saying that, you know, Afia's fears were real and tangible. What the social worker said was that they really weren't going to intervene. They really didn't think that this was an issue. And in fact, what they said was, this is really a typical young Asian girl experiencing a bit of the culture clash. And that this is typical of adolescent girls of her background, and really should just, you know, sort of it'll even itself out and it'll all be all right. But really there wasn't any cause for social services to intervene. They absolutely refused to help, and when pushed said, we'll do it, but we have to get father's consent, which just seemed absurd. Given that the father, of course, was going to withhold his consent. In fact, he denied all the allegations and said that he only wished to take the family on holiday. And what stuck with me was what social services then said to me was, you know, I said, well, I think you do need to take her fears on board. She's only 13, this is a form of abuse, etc., etc. And their response was, well, actually, no, it isn't. And we wouldn't respond any different if it was a white girl whose family were taking the whole family to Australia. And I said, well, actually there is a major difference in the way, because one is about a lifestyle choice and the other is a life-threatening choice. And you need to recognize the difference, and they remained inflexible. So we then went to court and made her a ward of court. And then whilst there was a final hearing, pending a final hearing, the judge, presiding judge, said to social services, well, find her a home while you carry out some investigations. Find her a foster home. Unfortunately, the only homes that social services were willing to consider were other Muslim families. And Afia protested strongly, saying, I don't want to go to another Muslim family because they will say that I've been a naughty girl and a bad girl, and that I've been transgressing social religious norms, and I don't want all that to be reinforced. However, despite her protestations, social services did place her with a family whose attitude was far from supportive. I think one of the things it raised for me very early on was that whilst culture and language, heritage are important background aspects to take into account, I think it becomes dangerous when implemented as kind of blanket policy, especially when other needs of children, in this case in relation to placement in foster homes, are not taken to account, and when religion becomes a defining cultural and even racial criteria by which minority families are chosen. Anyway, the judge said, yeah, I understand the concerns, but I can't tell social services how to do their job. Not surprisingly, after a few weeks, Afia returned home to her parents. So then I had no further contact. The parents would not allow me to have any further contact with Afia from that moment onwards. Only social services were allowed, and social services didn't really go against parents' wishes. So at the final court hearing on wardship proceedings, social services argued, of course, for discontinuation of the wardship proceedings. And they produced a report stating that normal relations have been restored and there is no need for further intervention. Afia was never asked what she thought, and I could never speak to her separately. However, in court, I did try to argue that she should remain a ward of court temporarily as a means of as a measure of security and protection. But this was opposed by social services. And in their report, they justified their stance by saying that Afia's family is a poor family and they're victims of racial discrimination. And they argued that as head of the family, the father was merely trying his best to support and protect them from racism. And so their portrayal of the family's environment is, of course, a reality for many Bangladeshi and indeed other minority families. But by ignoring the father's abuse of power within his own family, they actually colluded in other forms of oppression. And I just want to read out, because I think this is so telling, a bit of this report that the social services produced. They stated, "What is left are differences of opinion between Afia and her parents, such as may arise in any family. Those differences will need to be resolved within the context of the family, and the possibilities of resolving them successfully may be diminished if the balance of power within the family is artificially distorted, since I believe it would seriously undermine the parents' confidence and authority." The judge, coming at it from another angle of keeping families intact, agreed to deward Afia, and he said, "I am satisfied that it is not appropriate for the court to take any further part. If one looks into any family, there are bound to be stresses and strains, but this does not mean that the state should interfere." So that was a really coming together of different institutions, one from a multicultural perspective, another from a more conservative perspective, keeping family together, and both collide in the middle. These responses were far from uncommon. This was the general state response that we would meet time and time again. By the late 90s and early 2000, as a result of incessant campaigning arising from a series of cases of forced marriage and the murder of women, now so-called honor killings, we actually began to finally see a change in state policy. And a critical moment was reached when in 1999, Mike O'Brien, the then Home Minister who led the forced marriage working group, of which we were members, and famously announced, "Multiculturalism cannot be an excuse for moral blindness." This was a really important seminal moment for our struggles against gender-based violence in the UK. He actually then advocated a mature multiculturalism, which did not compromise on women's equality. So I think that was really important. The problem is, it was short-lived. It was a short-lived moment of enlightenment. What we've had since is a dual and contradictory approach to minority women. On the one hand, there is greater recognition of specific forms of violence, such as honor-based violence, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, so on and so forth. And that has led to improved legal remedies and practices, the Forced Marriage Act, statutory guidance on forced marriage, and so on. Although I have to say that that recognition is not without its own problems, because these issues are increasingly also being tied into a kind of wider narrative on clash of civilizations, and a discourse that pits secular human rights values against cultural backwardness of minorities, and particularly Muslims and others. And it also ties all of these issues to a right-wing anti-immigration agenda. So we've also been having to confront the state for using some of these issues to justify more and more immigration controls, for example. So it's not, that recognition is not without its problems. But on the other hand, the state, at the same time as recognizing these issues, has also been promoting policies that have led to desecularization of public spaces, particularly in minority communities, which not only threaten the gains that we have made so far, but actually threaten the very survival of secular feminist projects like ours. And the most famous example of this was, again, our battle for survival in 2008, 2009, when the local authority decided to withdraw our funds in the name of cohesion and integration. So what if you remember, the Commission for Integration and Cohesion had put out a report which said that which recommended that single identity groups shouldn't be funded. So basically the local council used this to cut our funding, saying that you're a single identity group, and actually by funding you we are promoting segregation. And so what they said was, we only want one generic domestic violence service, we don't need specialist services anymore. They actually said a bit more than that. They actually then said the name of Southall Black Sisters itself breaches the Race Relations Act, because it deters white women from coming to you. And so it's discriminatory, it's divisive, and so on. And so we withdrew our funding, so we were forced to take the whole matter to court by way of judicial review, arguing that the council hadn't applied its own equalities impact policies properly. And we won. So we won legally because the council really hadn't applied itself to doing an equality impact assessment, and when it had done one, it did one retrospectively to justify its decision. The judge was mighty angry about that in court. He was well pissed off when he said, you know, you can't justify policies retrospectively, and you can't use equality impact assessment to justify policies. The impact assessment must happen at a very formative stage and not at the end of, you know, policy making process. But we also mounted a political campaign against what this symbolized. It didn't just symbolize the way in which policy was going to go in terms of funding for specialist groups, but it also did something else. Because at the same time that Ealing Council decided to cut our funding on the grounds that we were promoting segregation and were divisive by our existence, it decided to use prevent money to fund Muslim women-only groups, even though there was no demand for them, because they were all coming to us. So although there was no demand for them, the council was busy setting up, and you should have seen the list of projects that the council decided to use prevent money to promote. So it was clear that what the council was doing, and this wasn't just Ealing, of course it was replicated both nationally and in other localities, was actually was promoting a faith-based approach to minority communities, and constructing minority communities as faith communities. So what's been clear is that in the last few decades, what we've seen is that religion increasingly has entered the political sphere. And even in this country, where it is assumed that religion has been sort of relegated to the private sphere, it's actually never been absent from politics. And in the UK, of course, we've never seen a formal separation of church and state. But it was kind of generally assumed that religion had all but withered away. However, this lack of separation, I think, has come back to bite with a vengeance, because it really has provided a space for religion, particularly Christianity, to encroach on public institutions. So if any of you have been following what's happening in the women's sector, for example, the Salvation Army was awarded funding for for providing services to trafficked women, and that was taken away. That funding was taken away from a feminist project that was delivering that service. It's now gone to the Salvation Army. So what we've seen is that the space for religion has grown. And we've seen with that not only an upsurge of the Christian right, but of radical and fundamentalist groups in other religions, who all seeking to transform society along religious norms. And it is a phenomenon, of course, that we're seeing the world over. And I think the turning point for us in making explicit the link between gender equality and the struggle for secularism was, of course, the Rushdie affair. We saw the growing power of religious fundamentalism then, because what the religious fundamentalists were doing was using that multicultural terrain. But now, increasingly, they're using the multi-faith terrain to pursue vigorously a desecularization agenda. What we saw in the early 90s, following the Rushdie affair, was the rise of the religious right in all religions. And that created the conditions for the emergence of a culture of intolerance, fear, and censorship. And I think that culture remains with us in heightened forms. We witness with alarming frequency religious fundamentalists and authoritarian protests to any form of dissent against religious values and identities, much of which has focused on the control of women's sexuality. And of course, these protests are not just confined to Muslims. Hindus, Sikhs, and Christians have also sought to impose strict religious identity on followers by clamping down on dissent. And it would seem as if orthodox, if not fundamentalist leaders in all communities are vying for the control of the representation of their communities. And in the process, what they're promoting is very essentialist notions of religion, and promoting religion as a framework for highlighting inequalities and for demanding recognition. And I don't know if some of you remember, for example, the play Bezdi in Birmingham in 2005 is an example of one of many attempts by the religious right to clamp down on dissent. And in this case, it involved silencing minority women who spoke out from Sikh backgrounds, who dared to speak out against religious and cultural impositions that undermine their freedoms and rights. So if you remember, it was about a play involving the rape of a woman in a gurdwara. And so it dealt with issues of abuse and power in a religious power and a male power. And the protests, however, the religious right in Punjabi Sikh communities protested against the play, arguing that it threatened and offended their beliefs, and in fact protested so vociferously that they forced the play to shut, and the Birmingham Repertory had to sort of close that space completely. And what was interesting about the mobilization around that play was it wasn't just Sikh extremists who were involved, but even so-called moderate Sikhs. All of them said that the playwright had crossed the line by setting, and caused extreme offense by setting her play in what was regarded as a Sikh sacred place, the Gurdwara. And since then there have been Hindu fundamentalists who've protested against depiction of women in films, and Hindu fundamentalists who have protested and prevented exhibitions by famous painters which show Indian female deities, naked depictions of naked female deities. They've all argued that these cause offence and have had that exhibition pulled. This was in London a few years ago. And so what we're seeing is countless cases around the country, particularly in South Asian communities, where religious institutions have been involved or condoned domestic violence and sexual abuse and child abuse. And of course, that's not just limited to minority religions. We've seen the scandals in the church in Ireland and over here. There have been cases where religious leaders have sought to exorcise women or children by beating them, sometimes to death, for non-conformist behavior perceived as possession by evil spirits. There was a case not so long ago in Bethnal Green where a woman was beaten to death, supposedly because she was possessed, but probably because she transgressed norms. And although those kinds of cases represent the more dramatic end of the spectrum, on a daily basis, our users and others talk about how their aspirations are quashed by religious leaders on a day-to-day basis. They find themselves trapped at home because of the stranglehold of culture and religion. And because minority women have no effective political representation and no power to challenge the hegemony of religious establishment, they, along with other subgroups, have the most to lose by the rise of the religious right. We only have our voices of dissent as a tool. And this is why the suppression of dissent is hugely significant. It's not just a question of freedom of expression, but literally a matter of life and death for many. And this is why we supported Salman Rushdie's right to write. It wasn't just about freedom of expression. We knew that if they could silence him, they could silence others who are much more vulnerable. We also opposed the creation of the new offence of incitement to religious hatred in 2005 because we saw it as an attempt to introduce the outdated blasphemy laws through the back door. And we argued that the main targets wouldn't be those who foment hatred against other religions, but those who dissent within a religion itself. So particularly women, gays and lesbians, and others. And our fears were actually confirmed when a spokesperson from the so-called Sikh Human Rights Commission, who in response to the Besti play, stated on television that had the law on incitement to religious hatred existed, they would have used it to prevent the play from being performed. So what we're seeing is the increasing use of religion, euphemistically termed faith, by the state as the basis for identifying minorities. And although that began during the Rushdie affair, it's gathered momentum post 9/11 and the London bombings and the civil unrests in northern cities. In 2001, successive governments have vigorously promoted a religious or faith-based agenda. Cohesion, integration, big society, localism agendas, they all paradoxically also have given further fillip to fundamentalist and religious right forces who are in the process of consolidating power and control over communities and resources. And the pursuit of the faith-based agenda is partly to do with the perceived need to appease conservative leaderships, religious leaderships in our communities, so that they're delinked from extreme radical elements. So partly that pursuit of that agenda is to do with really isolating the more radical, really extremists in communities. But it's partly come out of this belief that the right to manifest religion itself signifies equal treatment of minorities. A belief that's actually shared by many equality and human rights institutions across Europe, and even within sections of so-called progressive left movements. And minorities in response, particularly to racism, and particularly Muslims in response to anti-Muslim racism, including women, Muslim women, are also increasingly becoming vigilant in their efforts to protect religious identity. And that's resulted in a series of demands for greater religious recognition. So the dominant demands for legal tolerance, cultural rights, access to public resources is evident, for example, in campaigns to extend the blasphemy laws, funding for religious schools, dress codes, and the right to apply personal religious laws in the governance of family affairs. These are just some examples of the demands that have come out of this kind of faith-based constructions. And they are really quite dominant demands. And of course, although the Muslim religious right have led the way, there are Hindus and Sikhs who are just waiting in the wings, who are also saying that who are also demanding that their educational, welfare and family needs should also be addressed in accordance with their religious values. So what you see, actually, is the way in which self-definition within communities and state constructions has led to a process of communalization of minority communities. So where back in the 70s, at least there was an attempt to unify, we now have we've splintered off even further along religious lines. It's a communalization that's gone on in our communities. And actually, the kind of demands for greater and greater religious identities have all been taken to be strong counter-hegemonic voices to Western cultural impositions, secular impositions. And minority rights are now increasingly and almost exclusively just linked to the right to manifest religion. What we argue is that in the process, the state's not able to distinguish between valid and legitimate demands for equality and those that simply mask inequality and promote intolerance, and so on. And even though these demands are using the language of discrimination, human rights, even anti-racism, they're actually subverting these very principles. They not only alter public culture, but also strengthen the control of women in the private sphere, and especially within social institutions from which the vulnerable seek guarantees of liberty and equality. So secular spaces are absolutely shrinking daily. What I would say is it's a mistake to ignore the underlying economic imperatives that's also driving the faith-based agenda. It's an approach, the faith-based approach neatly fits a wider neoconservative agenda involving the privatization of vital state functions and reducing the public sector. So the demise of the welfare state can't be underestimated for its impact, because the vacuum that's created has allowed religion to step in, advantaged as it is over secular groups by its vast membership networks and resources. And it is this aspect that the new coalition government in particular is appealing to when selling the idea of a big society. So the shifting of accountability for welfare services onto religious institutions is a dangerous development, but particularly for women, because it's actually delivering women back into the hands of powerful religious leaders. And one of my favorite scholars, Karima Benoun, who's a feminist and human rights scholar, has observed that the struggle to keep religion and the law separate is one of the most urgent struggles that's now taken place globally. And I think she's right, because we've seen in the UK the way in which demands to incorporate aspects of Sharia law in relation to the family within the English legal system has gained support. And it's not surprising in an economic context where the state is trying to slash legal aid and obviously trying to find ways of cutting back on time-consuming litigation. But it is a demand that is being supported not only by leading establishment figures in the church itself, but also in the judiciary. However, I would argue one of the problems that this brings is how does one decide in law what is authentic religious identity? What is valid religious identity? Because that's the contestations that are going on, particularly between subgroups, powerless subgroups and religious authority, is whose identities, whose demands are valid, whose opinion constitutes the authentic voice. These are all the contestation and battles that are now going on. And certainly some of the women that come to SBS have raised significant concerns about the way in which they are now being pushed into alternative methods of dispute resolution, which in their case inevitably means going to religious authority. I won't say any more on that because I think I should wrap up shortly. So what we're seeing is what we have argued at Southall Black Sisters is that we've argued that the state needs to exercise caution, that involving religious leaders and institutions, particularly in arbitrating on family matters, will send a mixed message and greatly undermine the gains that we've made so far. You know, without a shadow of a doubt, over the last few decades, it's secular black and minority women's projects, the refuges, the centres, the counselling services across the country that have been the driving force behind successful campaigns and services for women. It's been them who have led, it has been those women, those projects that have led campaigns against gender-based violence. And yet, in spite of that rich history of achievement, what we're seeing is more and more support and engagement with religious forums such as the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal that's been set up recently. And on the face of it, this forum presents itself as a professional body and says it adheres to formal legal rules of engagement and to non-discriminatory principles. But actually, if you look at them closely, what they're trying to do is to create the conditions for the establishment of a parallel legal system. And if you go onto their website and look at the way in which they've dealt with cases of domestic violence, you'll see what I mean. When I went on it not so long ago, they dealt with 6 cases of domestic violence without reference to, or without doing risk assessments, without reference to safety and protection. They mediated all the women back with their abusive husbands. And more than that, although they said that they didn't wade into criminal law, actually what they did was, in some of those cases, charges were pending against the perpetrators. And they, the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal, used their contact and influence in the CPS to get the charges dropped, arguing that they were mediating and they were sorting out the problems internally. So you can see what's happening. This is quite apart from the fact that there's actually no evidence that minority women want religious laws or want community-based systems of arbitration, and particularly those based on so-called divine law. So the women who come to us strongly oppose any religious arbitration in family matters. They believe that religion inherently discriminates against women and can never guarantee their equality or their well-being. And in fact, when we surveyed many of them, they expressed considerable fear and distrust of religious authority, which they saw as a continuation of community collusion that they experience when they're experiencing issues of violence and oppression. What I would say is the duty to exercise due diligence by the state, so the state's duty to exercise due diligence in order to prevent, investigate, and punish acts of violence against women, including those carried out by non-state actors, is a necessary function of a democratic state. It's part and parcel of the democratic process. But in the way in which the whole of the multi-faith agenda has panned out, in our view, this duty is clearly being subverted by the state's accommodation of demands for personal religious laws to govern family affairs in minority communities. And I have to say that the question that remains unanswered is why, despite evidence of discrimination and denial of rights for women and children in all religions, there is such widespread acceptance that family law can be culturally or religiously specific, rather than subject to universal human rights norms. So I would end by saying that our struggle for gender equality has actually reached a crossroads, a particular junction, where issues of race, religion, and gender intersect. The gains of mature multiculturalism has been overshadowed by multi-faithism. An assimilationist post-9/11 7/7 agenda has paradoxically given rise to a newfound confidence amongst religious authoritarians, fundamentalists, and also racists to make demands which limit the freedom of women and which limit freedom of minorities as a whole. And it's these political developments that have compelled groups like mine to defend even more vigorously the secular, black, anti-racist, feminist spaces that we created. Because I think that really what's at stake is no less than the fight for secular, progressive, feminist, anti-racist values. And really this is our most important struggle now. Thank you.
I was just thinking, because I actually agree with virtually everything you said. I was just wondering about how would you therefore view France with its commitment to laicite and its very strict separation of church and state, and its attitude towards dress, for example, of Muslim women. I'm just wondering how that fits with your defence, very strong defence of secularism and separation of law and culture and religion.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, you can take that one now, or we can get another one and answer it at the same time.
Okay, well, oh God, that's a big question. I think one of the things about dress code, the veiling, politics of veiling, is that really it's really difficult to talk about it in abstract. You've got to talk about it in its context, in kind of historical, political context. In France, there is no doubt that the way in which that whole debate has developed has led to kind of two camps. One that argues that this is actually majoritarian values masquerading as sort of secular values, and you know, this is a form of racism. And that really veil symbolizes the oppression of Muslim women. And then you have the other so-called camp that says, well, this is racism, and this we have right to sort of autonomy and self-determination and so on. So you have one side saying secular values, we have always constitutionally been separated, you know, have had a separation of church and state. It's come out of struggles, political struggles in the past, and so this is just us evening everything out, and so on. I think it's a really difficult one, because I can understand how that is perceived as racist. And it is racist when you think of the wider context in which minorities are treated at one level. What I would say is that for me, the most interesting response to that whole debate was a women's group that said, we're neither virgins nor sluts. That's kind of English translation of their name. These women from minority community. And they took a stance that was not very different from the stance SBS took, which is that on the one hand, we have to challenge the French state for trying to impose particular value system, which actually is a majoritarian value system, and quite racist. But on the other hand, we also have to recognize in our communities that these imperatives to veil comes not out of individual choice, but out of political developments from within. And these political developments must be understood. And so what they were saying is basically a pox on both your houses, you know. And in a sense, that has been the stance that we've always tried to take on sort of issues. So, for example, when the ways in which, you know, our whole stance on the Rushdie affair, we decided that it was really important to support him at a time when it was very easy for racists and others to sort of paint pictures of Muslim minorities as really backward. I mean, look at them, they're burning the book, they haven't even read it, and you know, look what they're doing in terms of treatment of their own women. And so it was very easy in that kind of situation to sit back and say, well, actually, you know what, there's a lot of racism, let's not say anything. But on the other hand, the whole veiling issue is a very interesting issue, because I've seen, for example, just in the course of 30 years, the ways in which women who are traditionally dressed suddenly dress in a particular way, which is very much a religious imposition. And it comes actually from Salafi Muslim background, which is a very orthodox, authoritarian form of Islam, which is being imposed. So that whole black dress, it's absolutely not traditional in Bangladeshi culture, for example, but it's being imposed. So there's a politicization of religion. So what we did by taking a stance that says we have to somehow find a way to oppose the state and the way in which the state stereotypes, or the way in which the right, the racist right, stereotype minorities, at the same time as take a stance against the kind of religious right developments within our communities. And these are not easy positions to take, but you have to take them, because otherwise, by just falling in line with one or the other, you're colluding. So what I would say about the veiling debate is that it has to be understood in its context. And I think that it does raise interesting questions about how you deal with that. And I think, you know, the popular view in the French situation is that you had minorities against the state and the state imposing, where actually there was space where other groups, particularly minority women's groups, were trying to say, you know what, there is a point about the ways in which dress codes are being imposed on us to control our sexuality. And we do need to be talking about these things, whilst at the same time challenging the racism of the French state in all sorts of ways, whether it's through immigration controls and so on and so on. And that's the only position you can take. So in our context, in the English context, we're trying to deal with the ways in which the state has very draconian security measures, counter-terrorism measures, which have, you know, sort of ridden roughshod over the rule of law, and the ways in which, you know, people have been detained without a fair trial and so on and so forth. These have to be opposed, but at the same time, that doesn't give the religious right the power to then delegitimize other voices that say, hang on a minute, but our religious identity doesn't mean this. Or why can't we determine what our religion means for us? Which is what a lot of the women who come to the centre say. They're not non-believers, they're believers. But what they're saying is, we wish religion is a personal relationship between me and my God. And in any event, I don't subscribe to the view that I should remain silent about abuse and violence, wherein I don't interpret my religion in that way. So, you know, these are some of the ways in which you've got to take stances against what goes on internally, but also how, when we raise these issues, they're co-opted and used by the other right-wing forces and the state in pursuit of other agendas.
Yeah.
Yes, I think, I won't go into the Quilliam Foundation, but I do want to speak to another organization that actually is very similar in aim with the Quilliam Foundation, and that's British Muslims for Secular Democracy.
Yeah.
And this organization is interesting in that they actually have an individual, I don't know if he's a staff member or not, but he was a member of the EDL, and I think he's an ex-EDL member, and they've brought him on board. And apparently he does a lot of outreach work with Muslims, but it's very suspect. I think well, I'm speaking of Charlie Flowers, this is the individual I'm speaking to.
The
And-
EDL
Yes.
deputy.
we don't even know if this is his real name, or if this is, I don't know, an alias he's going by, or even if he's complicit with any type of police surveillance and spying. But at the same time, you see this organization claim to be working on behalf of Muslim women and the Muslim community, or as they like to say, moderate secular Muslims in that respect. But at the same token, they've instituted, or they're colluding with, the most conservative forces within the government at the moment, and creating laws that are basically separate for brown folk, basically separate from Muslims. So, like for instance, with the whole honor crimes and forced marriages, I mean, there is existing legislation. I mean, there's domestic violence legislation. Instead of bolstering that and saying when it comes to Asian communities or Muslim communities that these must be adhered to and followed, they're basically saying, well, we need to have a separate law for the Muslim community, primarily for the Muslim community, when in effect it kind of replicates a lot of the racism that already is happening within the Muslim community. And maybe you can speak a little bit more about, or how, but I just wanted to alert you to this. What's going on?
I don't know. Well, certainly the Quilliam Foundation, I don't know what's going on. I mean, I know that the EDL guy has sort of moved over to the Quilliam Foundation, and they were helping to monitor and map extremist elements within our Muslim communities. And then suddenly, you know, the EDL guy goes over. I really can't speak about that because I don't know what's going on. I mean, it's just a bit sort of, it's flummoxing me, to be honest, and I'm a bit sort of cautious about what that's all about. As far as, I don't know of what particular demands they're making around honor killings or forced marriage that's specific to Muslims only.
Well, they're making the legislation very much like that, you know, in terms of concocting and putting together legislation with very ultra-conservative members within the Tory party, which I find just, it's very confusing at the moment.
It is really difficult. Let me give you an example of the kind of strange bedfellows that you can get into if you're not careful. So, I don't know if any of you know Baroness Cox.
That's the person, actually.
That's the person you're talking about. Okay, so Baroness Cox is part of the Christian right. She was Plymouth Brethren, I think, years ago. Anyway, she's responsible for introducing Christian assemblies in schools in the 80s. Right, so she was very much associated with the Christian right movement. And she's up to no good, you know, in sort of the legislative level. She's sort of busy sort of fighting the Christian rights corner on a number of areas. But I'm aware particularly of her sort of attempts to get Christian assembly. Well, she did Christian assemblies in school and you know, Christianize the school environment. Anyway, so that's going on. So then recently she approached SBS, she approached lots of groups and said, right, I think that this whole Sharia laws is terrible. And it's really awful, and we really got to do something about it because these poor Muslim, you poor minority women, you're really suffering, you know, and we really need to make sure that, you know, I in the House of Parliament and House of Lords, I bring in a bill, and I say that we mustn't have any religious arbitration. She meant really Sharia, really. So now she actually came to SBS because she wanted our support. We actually support the bill, although I didn't agree with the way in which she had. I didn't agree with there was an undercurrent which was really demonizing Muslims, which I didn't like. But actually, formally, in terms of what she was presenting, it was fine. It was about religious laws, not using religious laws in family matters. And I've just spent, you know, best part half an hour talking about why that should be the case. However, the problem I had, and the problem SBS had, was, are we going to go with this woman who's part of the Christian right, who's opposing the Muslim right, in effect, but in the process, you know, there is all these coded language about how it's actually, we're superior, Christian values are somehow superior, it's part of the wider kind of nationalist narrative. We're going to go with this. So you'd be astonished at the number of black minority women's groups who did support her in the House of Lords itself and were willing to associate with her. Our stance was no. Although we agree with the contents of her bill, we're not sure that we want her to represent it. So what we did, and this is where you have to be a bit lateral thinking and creative. We said, I did send her away. I said, we support. She actually came with a guy from the Christian Alliance. I can't believe it. Anyway, so basically, I sent them away. I said, look, we do support what you're trying to do, but we're not going to be. Why don't you pass it on to someone else to represent it in the House of Lords? Of course, she wasn't going to have it because it was her baby. So she said, no. So I said, well, why not get Lord Leicester or someone else to present this? She said, no, you know, and for whatever reason, she was obviously wanting to control her own thing. And so we said, look, I'm really sorry, but you are associated with the Christian right, and we're not publicly going to be standing next to you, supporting it. So what we did was we did our own briefing, and we briefed Helena Kennedy. I met with Helena and I said, Helena, we don't want to, we support her bill, but I want you to represent our views, not from any religious perspective, not from a perspective that says cohesion and integration and British way of life is superior. No, I want you to present it from a human rights perspective, a women's human rights perspective. And we wanted Helena to do it because she has a track record in, you know, sort of, she has put her neck out under the Labour government and so on, and even, and it continues to be a thorn in the side of the establishment. So she seemed the best we could get in terms of making our point. So by making this, although we were supporting the bill, and you know, in the House of Lords in the debate, we were supporting it. We got someone else to put forward a perspective that was essentially locating this whole issue within the framework of women's human rights, rather than discourses around national, you know, sort of values and British way of life, and or you know, minority cultures and backwardness and all of that. And that's so. What I'm saying is these are not easy positions to take, and it's very difficult sometimes. But this is one way around it for us.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm slightly confused about the distinctions between multiculturalism and multi-faithism. Maybe it's because I've just been reading from Fatwa to Jihad by Ken Malik, which is a sort of critique of multiculturalism from presumably a similar perspective to your own. And there's no sense in that there's a transition from multiculturalism to multi-faithism. And just thinking about the Muslim identity, the Muslim identity that was created in the 1980s and that, you know, put forward so-called spokespeople for Muslim communities. You know, well, that's a faith identity. I don't see how the multi-faithism is different in a sense. And also, I mean, I just recently went to the West Indian Centre where they had Black History Month, and they were talking about the black community, and they were black community spokesmen. You know, obviously they were elected. Who they represent, I'm not sure, but they were talking about black health centres, so that just seems to be a continuation. All I can see is a continuation of multiculturalism. And then the second question is about the culture of intolerance, fear and censorship. You then, as a consequence of your analysis, seem to blame that on religious right and not see that as the continuation of multiculturalism. But just one example I was thinking of was Brick Lane, Monica Alley. There was demonstrations amongst the Bangladeshi community by so-called representatives of the Bangladeshi community. But where, you know, that's intolerance. Where does that fit into the religious right?
Okay, so I haven't read Keenan Malik's stuff. I'm just telling you the way that we see it, Southall Black Sisters. So whether multi-faithism is theoretically accepted or not as a concept, it's certainly something that we see. Yes, it is a continuation. In a sense, of course, it's a continuation. So what you have under multiculturalism was cultural enclaves. What was happening was minority communities were defined more in terms of their cultural sort of traditions and so on. What I think we're now seeing is much more that minority communities are identified along faith lines. And we can't deny that that has happened. So what happens is, whereas before community leaders were unelected and, you know, representing no one but themselves, really, we now have religious leaders who are unelected and representing no one but themselves. So really, yes, there is a continuation, but what we're seeing is the increasing role of religion as the framework by which needs are identified and articulated. Identities are articulated using a religious framework. And I think that that process is a two-way process. It comes from self-definition. And this is where what we're seeing is dominant religious groups within minority communities demanding the right to be defined in a particular way. And one of the interesting things about the whole way in which minority communities have since splintered into faith communities is, you know, when all this stuff around the bombings, the 9/11 and 7/7 and the northern city stuff was happening, you had leaderships from Hindu and Sikh backgrounds who are actually saying, you know what, don't classify as Asians. We don't want to be classified as Asians, because if we're classified as Asians, which is how it would have happened under multiculturalism, we will be lumped with Muslims, and actually we think Muslims are the problem. So actually what the Sikhs and Hindus have been doing is saying, classify us as according to our faith. And if you look at the major policy documentation, for example, the Runnymede Trust, actually I think actually was quite responsible for contributing to the recasting of minority communities as faith communities when it brought out this report saying connecting Hindus, yeah, and similarly Sikhs. And in fact, what you've seen since is also one or two Sikh members, if I'm not wrong, who joined the EDL, because the EDL also said, actually, you know what, we're not opposed to all these Asians, but we are opposed to these Muslims. And you had Sikhs joining. So there is definitely more and more religion has been used as a defining category for minorities. And to the extent that there's a continuity, it's the way in which it all remains undemocratic and, you know, entrenches power in the hands of a few. What I'm saying is that that power is firmly entrenched in the hands of religious institutions. And more, the dominant religious institutions are right-wing religious institutions in minority communities. So they get to define identity. They get to define what needs are. And they get to sit at the public table with the government. They're the mediators. And so, in a sense, there is that continuity in terms of lack of democracy, the ways in which, you know, they continue to be gatekeepers between state and community. But more and more, it's religion that's that's the focus. And the ways in which constructions of minorities as faith communities is a really worrying development, because it means religion becomes a framework.
Okay, thank you. I think there's a question at the back.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you see religion and faith as the same thing, because you seem to be using them as interchangeable.
Okay, I am using it interchangeably in the way in which the state policy has used it interchangeably. So what I'm saying is that, you know, if you look at all the kind of policy documents, they talk about faith-based identities, faith communities, actually they mean religious. That's what they mean. And yes, I think faith is wider than just religious. But I'm not using it in that sense. I'm talking about the way in which state policy is using the two things. I started off by saying right at the outset, it's not about being anti-religious and being, you know, what I'm saying is that secular spaces for me are spaces where both those who are religious and non-religious coexist without religion defining everybody.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I agreed a lot of what you were saying. And I mean, I was at was at a conference at the weekend, they had a presentation from the Institute of Race Relations who were talking as well, and they were also talking about how they struggles to keep going even, and an organisation as long as that, with a tradition like that, and the same with Southall Black Sisters in a way, you know, a whole tradition, and how yet you're still, you know, it's almost a struggle to survive and do the work you've done. So simplify. And I agreed with what you know, most of what you said about the importance of kind of defending multiculturalism at a time when, I mean, we've seen, particularly just in the last, 6 months, mosques being bombed up and down the country, Muslim community in particular under siege, but feeding into a wider kind of, potential racist backlash, largely killing Big Bigby. But one thing I kind of slightly, now we're seeing attacks on the Roma community as well, and it's just, again, has to be opposed. Just quick plug, the EDL, who, they're weak, they haven't really, they're split and divided. They are coming to Wakefield on the 23rd of November, so that might be a date for people's diaries to come over there. But just one bit where I slightly disagreed with you. Slightly, you talk about the growth of religious right, and I think you're right, and I can understand how that is, it's a problem. And of course, I think part of it, what you've described as the awakened state since 2005, in particular, Boris has had a dual-track strategy for British state. So on one hand, trying to co-opt Muslim community leaders, if you like, on one hand, to bring them on side and say, don't go on demonstrations against racism or anything like that. Look, we'll listen to you. Come on board with us. We'll try and give you something, in return for you keeping the community quiet. And on the other hand, an immense state, ratcheting up the state repression, generally speaking, against those communities in order to also keep them quiet. So even Muslim communities are under siege by the British state. And I think in that context, this is why I slightly disagree with you on why a Muslim woman might choose to wear a veil. Part of it might be a sense in which what you're saying, state religious right and they're kind of being forced. I think it also might be, a Muslim woman might decide to wear a veil or something like that where she previously hadn't, as a statement of defiance against the climate of racism anyway. And I think in some ways wearing a burqa, whatever it is, particularly if say something like France, is actually a very, very grave thing to do for a Muslim woman when you've got, they could be physically assaulted in the streets by racists who are given that much confidence by what the state have done to just, attack them and get off. So that was just a one slight thing. I think there's a context about imperialism over the last 10 years, which is killing of Muslims, in environments which you didn't really talk about very much, how imperialism fits into this. A context of state repression at home, and I think in a sense the reason why the religious right are growing is in part because women are choosing to identify as a way of resistance against the state as well. Some. It's incredibly complicated. So
I think it is complicated, and I think one of the things that it's not an easy position that the one I'm giving is not even the most popular position. The popular position is as Western imperialism, and anything goes. These are counter-hegemonic voices, these are counter-hegemonic identities, therefore, how can you begin to challenge any of this when there is this, the might of the Western imperialism? What I'm saying is actually fascism comes in many forms. And I'm saying fascism, there are white fascists, there are brown fascists. And the problem that we have is not identifying those within who are also deeply threatening. So, I am not interested in arguing that it's just one or the other. The counter-hegemonic and the kind of mobilizing against racism, against state repression, against imperialism are equally problematic identities and forces and ideologies and so on. And what's going on is it's global. You're right, it's a global thing. And actually that's precisely why we have to interrogate who are the counter voices and what are these counter movements, because they are also globalized. And they are part of a wider political imperative. And in that context, so when you talk about veiling, these are not just individual choices of autonomy and female agency. These are political imperatives. These are partly also about political ideologies and where those demands fit in a wider political movement. And let me give you one example of what I mean by contextualizing the debate around veiling. So if you remember, do you remember that girl in Luton, Shabina Begum? She went to a local state school, which was largely Muslim children. And the Muslim girls wore salwar kameez, which is those long loose trousers and tunics. And this was a uniform that had been carefully thought through by the parent governing body, the school governing body and the head and parents. So they'd all come to this negotiation of what the Muslim girls should wear, right? And the girls were happy, everybody was happy. Then along comes Shabina one day, decides to wear the full burqa, and says, this is my identity now, and this is what I want to wear, in opposition to the school uniform policy. And the school says no, for all sorts of reasons you can't, and safety reasons, all sorts of, we have a policy, this is a uniform, and you need to comply. And she says no, and so they then say, well, you then have to leave. And she then argues that her right to manifest religion was violated, and the right to education was violated because she was no longer able to go to that school. The matter wound its way from local court to high court, appeal court to the Supreme Court, right? And at the Supreme Court, the judgment was that the school was right and that her right to education had not been violated and her right to manifest religion had not been violated. And what the court said, and if you want to, you should read that judgment. It's a really good, nuanced judgment. And on that panel was our only feminist judge, Baroness Lady Hale. And she was really good in the way in which they gave a judgment that was quite nuanced. And what they said was that actually what they said was the school had worked out its uniform policy in consultation. It was a democratic process in consultation with the school community. And her compliance of it was not in breach of the law. What they also said was she was entitled to go to another school that didn't have that policy, and so that her right to education was not violated. And it was a really interesting judgment because one of the things that it alluded to, and this is what I mean by interrogation, of where these demands come from, for whose benefit, and what interests do they serve. Because what the judgment also alluded to, although it didn't form the main judgment, the background, the political background to this whole thing. She was assisted by her brother. Her brother was part of a political shadowy group that wasn't just opposed to the dress code in that school, but was actually opposed to Muslim children being educated in secular state schools. And her brother was the one who was mediating between her and the school. So question, was it really her choice? Secondly, he and his group, political group, had actually carried out political protests outside the school while this whole thing was going on. Thirdly, all the other Muslim girls said, we do not want this dress code imposed. And this is what the judge said. The judgment said it had to balance her needs against the needs of all the other Muslim girls who said, we don't want it. And the reason they said, because they were already intimidated for not wearing the full works. And what the judgment said was that these girls were really fearful that if this came to pass, and if she was allowed to wear the whole burqa, they would be under pressure to also then start wearing it to show that they're proper Muslim girls. And if they didn't, they would be labeled bad Muslim girls. So you're talking about a dimension that's looking at gender equality, which I thought was amazing for the Supreme Court to even bother to sort of allude to all that, but it did. And so what I'm saying is that what you're talking about, it could be, and the brother was arguing, this is racism, state racism, look at the way we're a besieged minority, look at the way Muslims are treated, so on and so forth. That was part of the narrative. but actually there was something else also going on, and it's really important to interrogate that. And that is what I mean by looking at the ways in which gender, religion, race intersect.
Yeah, question at the back.
Right, I'd just like to add to that. Very interesting case that was introduced in this time. Well, for one, I don't think the school, the state school, where they've chosen to introduce the shalwar kameez as a uniform was a secular one to begin with. Why would they do that? So if the governing body, whoever really decided on that, if you inquired as to what their reason was to introduce this uniform, it would be that they consider the shalwar kameez to be more moral. Because I'm pretty sure that they consider the uniform that's in other state schools of England or across UK is immoral. It's not the way that they would, or the prescribed way in Islam. One. Two.
Sorry, who's they?
Well, the governing body of the school, I mean, the people who had decided on shalwar kameez. I think I know where they're coming from. To shalwar kameez to begin with, and not go for the common uniform, pretty much reflects that fact. Two, because shalwar kameez is the kind of dress where you're literally covered from down your neck to your toes, and except for your hand and your face, nothing else is really showing. All she needed to do was she needed to put up the veil across her face and a hijab maybe. That would have complied with the definition of a burqa. She did not really have to go for that extra layer of that, the black dress. So, I mean, I'm just wondering if anyone tried to sort of reason with her brother or Shabina herself if.
No, he was too busy intimidating all the other school children, so I don't know how much he would have got out of reasoning, because he was in that pushed him as far as he did. Whatever she did, I think the point, I mean, I actually think that there's a grain of truth in what you say. I actually think the court could have gone further, didn't go far enough. Nevertheless, what they did do was important, and it is a really important judgment. Insofar as what they said was there was a democratic process going on in the way in which the school consulted over what should be the uniform. I agree with you, that actually what these girls, what they're wearing may not actually be their complete choice, but nevertheless there are complex negotiations often going on in everybody's homes in their daily lives over what they wear, and it's better they wear that and be at school than not be at school at all. I don't know. I'm just talking about the kind of complex, difficult negotiations that go on between parents and girls all the time in more traditional families. Nevertheless, what the court was just saying was it was a democratic process. So insofar as it did agree with everybody, everybody had come to a consensus on it, then how could it, how could that be unlawful then in terms of the way in which she was excluded? So I think they were looking at the process. Had the school arrived at its decision in a process that was lawful? What Shabina, chose to wear or not is interesting, because I think if you, even in Pakistani, one of the things that amazes me is the number of women that come from Pakistan. I see women all the time. Coming from abroad, first generation, who just say to me, where are all these traditions being invented? We don't even have them back home. Yeah? What is all this? We don't wear these black burqas and things back home. We might cover our heads, sort of with a loose shawl or something, but we don't have all this. What is this reinvention? And I think it's something really peculiar to diaspora communities, the way in which cultural, traditional values are constantly reinvented and actually have no bearing with lived reality in countries of origin. To that extent, there is a very imagined a kind of, homeland that they are reverting to, and very imagined cultural identities and religious identities that actually have no bearing with the lived reality and practice of people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Barry?
I want to ask a question relating to your story, just after another story, after hearing what I think was a fantastic speech. I just wonder what happened to that 13-year-old girl that you mentioned, as I had similar experiences of somebody who was older and got forced into a marriage, forced marriage, which wrecked her life. But the story I just want to relate is one of the Labour Party in the 70s, really. Which is then obviously becoming an increasing number of Muslims in the community, and the white community was adjusting some well and some not so well, let's put it like that. I was at a Labour Party meeting when Muslim community leaders came along and said the women are taking the kids to school and they're getting racially abused. We've come to talk to you about this. And some of us suggested, well, why don't we have a meeting so that we all get together and as a community discuss how we should deal with these matters first. Oh, no, says the community leaders, deal through us. We want the negotiations through us. Oh, no, say the Labour councillors, deal through us. We'll deal with the community leaders. And so what you got was the political world and the religious world, if you like, colluding in not us meeting and talking as human beings. Now, I'm not saying that led to 7/7 and all the rest of it, but that failure, that moment of failure to not talk to each other, and I think that's one of the things that's been lost, and I don't know how we reclaim that so that there are those conversations between people. And there's going to be bigotry when you bring different communities together. People have all sorts of weird ideas about each other. When my Jewish mother moved to Stoke-on-Trent during the Second World War, they asked her about all sorts of habits, and she said, I think you're talking about the Eskimos, not the Jews. That's how it goes. But if there's a conversation, maybe you sometimes see the human, and that's what often gets so lost.
Afia, what happened to Afia was basically I lost complete contact with her after she returned home. I heard years later that one of the reasons why she left the foster home that she never wanted to go into in the first place, but the reason why she left within weeks of being placed there was that she was subject to sexual abuse. So, and then I lost all contact. Her father wouldn't allow me anywhere near the front door. I couldn't get through the front door. So I lost all contact, so I don't know what happened, whether they were all taken back to Bangladesh or not. I hope not. I hope she found a way of resisting and getting on with her life. One of the things I've always thought is I'd love to meet the social worker now that I hadn't, confronted then, and whether she'd hold those same views now. On the question of getting together and talking about it, I think that's why we have to constantly talk about democratic structures of accountability. I think what I'm talking about is the ways in which the state has tended to view minorities as objects of social policy rather than as citizens. And when you talk about citizens, you start talking about rights and democratic structures of accountability so that rights are realized. And once you start doing that, you're in a much better space in terms of how people coexist and how, rights, basically a rights-based culture can take hold. I think the problem for too long is a very colonial sort of mindset. So the idea is, take me to your leader and tell me what, the issues are for your community, and whether that was community leaders in the past and increasingly religious leaders now, doing both, appeasing and co-opting at the same time is being repressive. That also happened in the 80s and the 70s. You had a bound of, now they just call them interfaith, sort of committees. They used to have the same kind of cozy meetings before with leaders. So I think that's the problem. That's not democratic. That's not transparent. That's not about inculcating a culture of citizenship. that's just treating people in this kind of colonial master-servant